relationships between South, I can say, because specifically here in Brazil we have more than 100 of indigenous people, something about 200 different languages spoken here in Brazil. Second problem is the problem of cultural relativism. We know that somehow cultural relativism is a kind of imperial tolerance of respect for the other. You respect them, conceding them culture. They have different cultures, which means that they also have different beliefs. So when you have, I don't know, polemic issues like baby killing, and all these kind of problems, you say, oh, this is their belief, and this is their culture, we should respect. This is the most extreme case that crossed my mind now, but in Bolivia, we have all this discussion nowadays, regarding the revolutions of law and etc. and the notions of representation that are going on there. But somehow cultural relativism grants for other people the possibility of having other beliefs and having other cultures, but not exactly other positive knowledges and other ontologies, because somehow what happens is that everybody is attached to the same reality, which is nature. Things out there, facts, and of course the facts, nature, etc. are much more explained, much more better explained by science or philosophy. So once we keep it with this possibility that science explains reality, philosophy understands the world, our common world, and they might have the right to have their own cultures and beliefs, it's all right. But please do not transform their beliefs or cultures in something analogous to science or to philosophy, because otherwise our very notion of reality would be destabilized. If we move from the problem of relativism to the problem of relationalism, then we have another problem at stake. We will have to connect worlds or modes of existence, instead of connecting beliefs. Then when we connect worlds or modes of existence, we have to redefine, of course, the very notion of materiality, of the individual, of the person, and all the backgrounds that we're used to. And then you might have a kind of different relationship and a possibility of producing another way of connecting differences, which is not exactly the way of reducing differences to our own tools of discourse, to our own narrative frames, to our own explanations, or to our own metaphysical necessities, which is the very problem of relativism that I was talking about at the beginning of my talk. This is my concern with contemporary art, because at the same time that people are being interested in animism or perspectivism, etc., people might be much more projecting their own metaphysical affrays and necessities upon the others, like I have to resolve my problems between breaking the difference between the subject and the object, the problem of solipsism, the problem of animating the material, and whatever. All these problems that arise exactly from the Western metaphysics and then colonizes other people's works.
I've come to sort of appreciate how issues of temporality specifically are especially a problem in coping with different kinds of early colonial artifacts in the context of Brazil. And here I'm showing you just kind of 3 examples, and probably most of you read the article that this is based on today. But here I'm showing you on the screen a Tupinamba feathered cloak from the early 16th century, somewhere in the first 20 years of the act. I'm showing you azulejos from the 18th century from Bahia, and an image from Carlos Julião of an Afro-Brazilian woman who's actually wearing a manjinga bag around her waist, which was a very kind of important kind of colonial artifact and object that circulated around the Atlantic world. And in dealing and thinking about the variety, diversity, and abundance of different kinds of material culture in the early 16th and 17th century, these objects, in a way, how do you cope with them as a historian for interpreting or understanding what they mean and how they were made and how we can understand social practice, right? And this is incredibly difficult. So all of these artifacts, in a way, present problems. So for the Tupinamba on the left, we have no written language. We have no period sources the way we would have for other cultures in the Americas in different kinds of ways. We have only 11 artifacts that survive, okay, in the world for featherwork for this particular culture. And those sources are largely written and in a diverse range of European sources and European languages, excuse me. So our access to sort of language is taken down, and the object itself gives us, in a way, the richest source of material we can to approach it. And I'll talk about this with the kind of material analysis I've been doing with these objects. But in a way, the object and an examination of it in its fabrication and its making, in a way, gives us a kind of rich avenue for consideration of what we can make of its meaning and its ritual use and its various contexts that it shifted in and out of, okay? Azulejos are another, problem or issue in the context of Brazil. None of them were ever produced. There were no azulejo workshops in Brazil, for example. All of these azulejos were imported, even if they had a huge impact on building practices in the colonial period. Largely, they were produced in Northern Europe, in the Dutch world, based on Ming porcelain and other sorts of things. So there's all these sort of intercultural crossings that azulejos make to sort of form a kind of visual skin for the making of colonial Brazil. But they themselves, in a way, are bound up with their own kinds of histories. So how do we interpret that when we don't have local artists? We have builders in Brazil, we have artists in Europe, we have narrative strategies that are being lifted from different literary sources across early modern Europe, etc. And then the last sort of consideration for kind of object type that is a problem too in the colonial context are the mandinga bags, which the woman in the upper right is wearing, which were amulet bags that circulated in the Atlantic world from the very beginning of, they existed in some form from the 16th century and have lasted all the way actually through the 20th century in various contexts. But these are largely bags full of efficacious material from across the Atlantic world that in the 18th century, during the slave era, were used as a way to avert harm and avert slavery. They were used, men used them for aid in gambling or for birth control. They had a kind of variety of different uses in a kind of social practice, but largely as a kind of artifact, they're fascinating because in a way they're invisible, right? Their potentiality, like kind of relics or whatever, they're invisible. So the pouch that you see encloses materials that we don't have access to, right? But that kind of have a potent agency inside of them, a kind of efficaciousness. But they turn into a kind of jewelry form in Minas that becomes very popular and becomes considered an artistic form. And in the 20th century, I'm working currently on a project on the police in Rio, and you find mandinga bags from the 20th century that were used on the city streets in Rio. So there's a kind of longue durée of these. So in a way, none of these artifacts, I feel like, can be stabilized with any sense of periodization or with any kind of fixed sense of kind of geographic area. Bringing this all together in a kind of a current project that I'm working on a history of the civil police, only because, in a way, this institution, in a way, is a kind of living example of the kind of, I think, intercrossed histories that are talked about in Werner and Zimmermann, which I want to kind of use as a provocation today. But this is an institution that was, this is the police headquarters, built in 1910, and housed in it the police school, where all lawyers, if you were entering into the civil police force in the beginning of the 20th century, you had to have a law degree, first of all, and you had to have 2 years of formal training inside the police school. This police school also served as a museum, okay, and it was also called the Museum of Methodology. And in it, there was a museum where the police students trained on how to identify crime visually and how to understand what crime looked like. Okay, this is a unique thing in the kind of history of the police. As far as I know, there's no other police institution outside of Brazil that had the same training through objects and images. Okay, in the school, the students again had to take 2 years of class training, and they learned how to identify different kinds of potential criminal objects. These objects, in a way, are interesting to us today because they give us some sense in the early 20th century of what was considered dangerous or problematic on the city streets of Rio. And essentially, the museum was organized in a kind of topographic way, which charted out, in a way, crime by location in the city. So certain neighborhoods in Rio had different sort of localized problems. So you might have problems encountering people who used and sold machetes in a particular area. There were problems with drugs in one area of town. There were problems with candomblé practices in other areas of Rio and the suburbs around it. So the museum, in a sense, became a kind of topographic way of charting out kind of the visuality of this in the 20th century. I bring this in a way into the discussion today because, in a way, I think this as a kind of modern institution shows us the way that we have, in a way, different sort of disciplinary intellectual practices that are kind of crisscrossing in one space through different kinds of objects, through the way that objects are kind of used and how they function. Here I'm actually showing you the collection of legal medicinal wax casts that were used to show, I think I have a close-up, they were used to show things like what a victim of a boxing injury would look like. And they hired artists to come from Italy to work with the police force to create these casts. So there was an interaction between the police force and different artists in different regions. And I'm particularly focused on the Afro-Brazilian collection of artifacts that they have, in which we have Mandinga bags from the 20th century, for example. Here I'm showing you different objects that were actually seized by the civil police force in the 20th century from different candomblé terreiros across Niterói in Rio, in different attempts of crackdown of local religion. These objects were seized. They were actually jailed into miniaturized cells, okay, inside the police force, inside the police building, along with the ethnographic story of how they were seized, okay, and in what ritual practice was taking place at that time. Each artifact was locked up in its own little case. This is a really bizarre occurrence, but it in a way shows us, in a way, by the police doing this, they're showing you the efficacious nature of the object. They're actually promoting it, they're preserving it, and they're giving a sense of the legitimization of the object through the act of collecting, okay? And so when I started researching this, I was thinking, oh my God, I've worked with this idea of kind of how we can think about, I don't know, disciplinarity and scale and temporality in the early modern period. But in a way, I feel like this museum, in a way, presents similar kinds of paradigms, but in a 20th century context. Many of the civil police officers were candomblé practitioners themselves. Okay, further complicating the matter of between kind of object position, subject position, who's doing the seizing, what they understood about it, how they preserved these objects, et cetera, et cetera. The museum today, these objects have never been displayed. These were never open to public display. It was the one collection that was invisible. The police used it for teaching, but it was invisible to the public. And today, these objects are actually housed in cartons in the morgue in Rio.
And having the sense of that we all seem to be pushing against the idea, or pushing towards the idea that we need to produce different kinds of knowledge, and we need to produce different kinds of epistemic problematics, different kinds of epistemic inventions, perhaps is the right word to say. And I think to be quite frank and maybe blunt about it, I really enjoyed, Pedro, your clarity on the fact that what's at stake here is really the creation of other modes of existence. And that somehow the project of destabilizing hegemonic narratives that have resulted from the projects of colonizing Europe and have unfolded in terms of a capitalism that has resolutely and systematically favored a project of the North and violated colonial, ex-colonial, and southern spaces. That what's at stake here is that in seeking out new epistemologies, we are seeking out other modes of existence. And that the stakes are no less than that, really, in the project of undertaking this, these claims on new practices of knowledge. So, as we would say in South Africa, it's fucking important. You know, it's not as if this is a kind of interesting intellectual project. It's not as if this is simply you know, a new frontier of sexy theory, right? I mean, I think it's important that we keep on the table that the project of shifting the basis of our knowledge is really the possibility of shifting a new way of being in the world. And so the work that we do in this regard is of serious importance for being able to imagine new kinds of worlds and new kinds of world orders. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. And Pedro, I'm very glad that you put that on the table quite strongly, because I think those are quite literally the stakes. So with those stakes clarified, I think we need to be also clear that our intellectual work should be concerned with nothing other than claiming the right of undoing the epistemological violence of the North in its representation of the South. This, I think, is that we have lived under a regime of knowledge in which certain tropes of certain people have been systematically rolled out that have produced global hierarchies and have produced a very violent structure of knowledge and a very violent structure of world power. So the task should be to claim the right to the undoing of the structure. That as we think about claiming other modes of existence and of producing new modes of living in the world, that we have to think about how do we undo the epistemologies of colonialism and later of new forms of what some people call neocolonialism or neocapitalism. Amy, I think you come at it from a very different, or perhaps from a different discipline and from a different tradition. But I think what you're arguing provocatively is that we can't think about difference without understanding that since at least the 16th century, difference has always been intercultural. Difference has always been global. Difference has always been crossed. So what you're posing for us is how do you think about the retrieval of these really important objects within an argument that you can never position feather work or tile work or these pouches and their interiorities from any kind of place of autocracy or purity. That there is always in the production of these objects and the production of knowledge around them a kind of plurality and a kind of instability. Since the 16th century, so this is not a recent idea. This is something that has been, in fact, this multiplicity, this plurality, this complicity and complexity has been part of knowledge production since the 16th century. So I think this is a productive tension in your engagement, in your two is that on the one hand, I think, Pedro, you're saying that difference exists, and we can draw on it. And Amy, you're pushing us to think about how that difference can be understood even from the 16th century, that it's always a global, complicated, worldly phenomenon. I think what we've been thinking about from the context of producing knowledge from an African context is precisely this dilemma between, does one produce African knowledge or does one produce worldly knowledge from Africa? And how does one think about the problematic of difference in this context? Can one produce African knowledge? What might that project be? What might Africanness be assigned for in this new project of producing a different order of intellectual work? And a lot of us are pushing precisely in the direction that you're pushing, Amy, to say that from when and from which position can this African difference be argued? How does one not recuperate a kind of, how does one recover Africanness without saying that it is this completely different, separate place that has not always already been worldly? And how does one reinsert that knowledge into intellectual work without presuming that this difference isn't already worldly? So how does one put together the necessity of reclaiming specificity and place, and that we come from this a vast regime of different kinds of possible knowledges, but at the same time acknowledging that those knowledges are always already worldly, right? And I think they have very different implications for where we're going in terms of an intellectual project. Do we want to, for example, say that African, Brazilian, Amerindian knowledge is specific, important, and needs to be understood in its own context and in its own place, in its own places? So African knowledge is important to insist upon as something to be studied in its specificity, in its particularity, because it is that project that is going to change our trajectory of knowledge. Or is it important to do the work of reading Africa always in terms of this global project? And I think they lead into very different projects of producing Southern theory. And they have very different arguments about what a counter-narrative could be. And they have a different politics, I think. And they have different futures. So I suppose to ask us to reflect on these two different versions of how we enter into the spirit of creating a different knowledge for a different kind of world. One which is, I think, resolutely reclaiming our difference in its particularity, and one which is saying, how do we position Southern objects in a much more worldly sensibility?
I feel very invested in the minuteness and complicatedness and particularity of the kind of reconstruction of epistemologies in time and space. So to me as a historian, I feel like, does one go one way or one does the other? How do you sort of toggle back and forth, sorry. I feel like there has to be some way that one can do both to a certain degree, but I feel like it's incredibly important when one is trying to understand the stakes of historical material in being able to sort of think about epistemological constructions as much as one can, as well as taking a kind of meta perspective on where that sits in contemporary critique, in cultural theory, and so on and so forth. And I guess one thing that I couldn't help but think between the two of us, and I wish I had heard your whole presentation, is the issue of, I think, more and more within art history and artistic traditions, I'm convinced that we need to pay more attention to sites of social practice as the kind of locus for a kind of discussion of artworks in many ways. And I feel like in anthropology that's something that's long been done in a certain way, but that in art history it isn't. And I sort of feel like there's this also a kind of disciplinary dialogue. And I noticed that you were sort of trying to pose something about art and anthropology and what that meant. And I feel like that's also kind of a big issue here is what are these sites of social practice? And what are the political implications of that and the material implications of that? And how can we think about that? So that's also part of a counter-response to some degree to your comments.
We can have local production of knowledge, which creates ephemeral and transnational practices. So that would be one way to kind of answer your critique. So there are local knowledges, but they move towards a transnational practice, and that practice is decentered and acts as a counter-narrative and is a call to these different modes of sociality, which is at the bottom, I think, of the relation aesthetic practice. And I think therein is the interesting connection between artists' interest in the perspectivism of Vivek Srivastav.
A ideia é justamente pensar que ferramentas metodológicas podem sair dessa ideia de sul. E no primeiro texto que eu escrevi sobre essa ideia, eu uso muito a ideia da Hewen Connell, que a primeira ideia, o que tem no sul? Né? O sul não é só um lugar de pessoas pobres e criativas. Né? O sul é um lugar onde se produz teoria também e método. Um dos dilemas é que as teorias do sul, ou feitas em países do sul, circulam muito menos, né? Tem uma dificuldade enorme de serem circuladas. Em geral, são teorias que se tornam meio nacionais ou nacionalistas. No Brasil, acho que todo mundo conhece essa maldita ideia do pensamento social brasileiro, que não é um negócio que não é nem teoria, né, e nem metodologia, é uma coisa que só tem no Brasil. É uma espécie de mapear que teorias e que métodos têm sido desenvolvidos no Sul. Né? Para evitar, de certa forma, uma ideia de que no Sul o que nós temos? Nós temos práticas interessantes. Né? Uma espécie de divisão do trabalho entre perspectivas teóricas do Norte e perspectivas práticas do Sul, que eu acho que é um pouco o que os Komarov fazem, por exemplo. Né? Os Komarov conseguem desenvolver uma teoria bastante interessante sobre o Sul, mas o tempo todo, em nenhum momento essa teoria do Sul desafia nenhum dos cânones da própria antropologia que eles desenvolvem ou da antropologia clássica. Né? Então, para mim, essa ideia do Sul passa muito por essa ideia. Em primeiro lugar, fazer um mapa desses métodos e teorias que são utilizadas aqui, não necessariamente para pensar tudo, mas certas teorias e métodos pensados para objetos específicos, no meu caso, mais especificamente ainda, Terra. Né? Como pensar a Terra. Né? Questão principal, o Sul não está pronto, não é algo que exista, que seja, bom, agora nós temos aqui uma perspectiva do Sul, algo que esteja assentado. Né? Eu acho que o interessante dessa literatura é que justamente para pensar do Sul tem que construir o Sul primeiro, né? Que história é essa, que teorias são essas, que métodos são esses, como pensar possibilidades de equivalência e diálogos que não sejam os diálogos tradicionais da disciplina, né? E, é claro, evitar a ideia que todo mundo, acho que tem criticado essa ideia.
Oi, Marcelo, acho que cortou de novo. Espera um pouco.
Tá bom. A ideia de que o Sul, criticar a ideia de que o Sul,
Por um
obviamente,
pouquinho
não
aí,
é...
está cortando, pera.
Tá bom. E agora? Voltou? Tá dando para ouvir?
Voltou, agora está dando para ouvir, pode continuar.
Tá bom, então a ideia, eu estava tentando falar antes, a ideia de que não dá para limitar o Sul, obviamente é um espectro geográfico. Né? Há um tempo atrás eu fundei um journal com colegas da Índia, de vários países da África e alguns países da América Latina, chamado Agrarian South, e o nosso dilema todo era como representar na capa de uma revista o Sul. Né? A gente nunca conseguiu chegar a uma conclusão, porque o Sul cabia, em alguns momentos tem a China, a Hayward Connell, por exemplo, coloca a Austrália. Então o Sul é muito menos uma localização geográfica, aliás, não é nenhuma localização geográfica per se, né? Mas nesse sentido ele passa por uma maneira específica de fazer e também passa por uma maneira específica de criar certos objetos, certas especificidades para as ciências sociais. Nesse sentido, é muito mais uma sinalização do que seria possível, do que é interessante, do que algo que venha a criar um modelo único. Minha questão fundamental é como lidar com objetos, né, que emergem, por exemplo, no Brasil e na África do Sul, que são os meus casos aqui, que são mais escorregadios, que são ausentes do norte, né, que ganham usos, coisas que têm imagens parecidas, mas que ganham usos completamente diferentes no sul e no norte, sem precisar explicar o que acontece no sul, né? E aqui o sul, de novo, não é uma localização geográfica, é o que acontece em qualquer lugar, sem precisar se referir a uma espécie de centro explicativo. Justificar certos objetos e certas ações, né, no meu caso políticas, que não tenham exatamente uma derivação histórica que possa ser encontrada em outros momentos. Né? Usando de uma ideia que tem a ver com o nome do meu próprio laboratório de pesquisa na universidade, são coisas que não são exemplares. Eu acho que a ideia de sul serve, né, principalmente, ou pelo menos me ajuda, a pensar nessas coisas que não são exemplos de outras coisas. Isso, para mim, tem sido muito importante para lidar justamente com esses objetos, para pensar que um movimento, por exemplo, social na África do Sul, que luta por terra, não é como um movimento brasileiro que luta por terra. São duas coisas que existem em paralelo, que se encontram, mas que têm propriedades que não se reduzem metodologicamente umas às outras. Né? Então isso para mim é importante. É claro que o que eu estou falando aqui é no limite de como o Sul pode ser interessante para lidar com os limites da linguagem, ou assumir uma posição do Sul possa ser importante para lidar com esses limites da linguagem teórica e metodológica que nós temos. Essa não exemplaridade ajuda, por exemplo, a lidar com uma questão que é o problema que eu identifico nos trabalhos dos Komarov e nos trabalhos do Boaventura Santos, que é a ideia de que ou o Sul é um lugar do idílio, né, então, porque aqui é tudo diferente, né, ou, pelo contrário, né, que o Sul é uma espécie de lugar da vitimização. Né? Porque a vitimização, ela, no fundo, ela dá muito mais, e ela repercute, ela vende bem, porque ela mostra os crimes do Norte sobre o Sul, mas mostra muito pouco de que afinal de contas, o que Sul é esse, o que propriedades seriam essas que não seriam as propriedades coloniais. Afinal de contas, o que fazem os colonizados. Mas não os que fazem, não o que fazem os colonizados a partir justamente de que eles são só diferentes. Né? A partir a minha ideia, no fundo, talvez seja de que o Sul ele nos coloca para pensar sobre as não equivalências, né? O que não equivale, né? E o que pode ser criado. Então tem uma ideia de também uma coisa que é muito difícil nas ciências sociais, que é criar objetos novos. Uma sociologia do Sul seria uma espécie de mapa, né, desses objetos ainda não mapeados. Né? Mas não é que esses objetos, aí que é talvez o ponto mais difícil, não é que esses objetos estejam sozinhos no mundo. Né? Esses objetos, e as ciências sociais vai lá encontrar coisas que ninguém encontrou. Né? Não é uma busca do bom selvagem, por exemplo. São objetos que devem ser, e esse talvez o ponto, em situações muito específicas, objetos que precisam ser produzidos como específicos. E uma sociologia do Sul, ou o Sul como ferramenta metodológica, para mim, justamente é algo que tem que focar nessa produção, assim, como produzir algo diferente, né? Para tratar de coisas que são diferentes. E aí vem uma outra coisa que é importante. Né? Esses objetos que eu tenho falado o tempo todo, que seriam objetos do Sul, né? São objetos que só vão virar objetos do Sul se eles forem performatizados, né? Teórica e metodologicamente. Né? Então, e essa performatização, no fundo, vai ao encontro dessa ideia de que dar performance a algo, né, é dar agência, dar efeito, né, a esse algo. Né? Algo que não está, digamos assim, na lista, que na África do Sul tem muito... Surgiu uma expressão que é muito recorrente nos debates, sobre os debates da descolonização, que é o archive, né? Os arquivos, né, seriam catalogações de ontoformas, digamos assim, que não estão nos arquivos. Né? Esse seria um jeito, pelo menos para mim, de definir e de pensar essa sociologia do Sul, né? Ou pensar o Sul como uma ferramenta metodológica. Uma ferramenta que busca, ao invés de arquivar, né, produzir coisas, né, que estão fora dos arquivos. Né? E coisas que talvez não possam ser, num primeiro momento, arquivadas, ou que não possam ser simplesmente derivadas das categorias que já estão nos arquivos africanos, que é um debate local aqui, mas também nos arquivos do Ocidente, nos arquivos da humanidade, por assim dizer.
Marcelo, thank you so much. It was very, very provocative, and I really like your focus on objects. I think it's important. And I think, we've been running this project, the Johannesburg Workshop in Theory and Criticism in Johannesburg. And one of the key methodologies that we've been using to try and create intellectual work explicitly as a Southern intellectual project has been to force ourselves to create themes out of difficult objects from a Johannesburg landscape. Right. So, for example, one theme was how do you make sense of a shack, an informal house that is built inside of a formal apartment building in downtown Johannesburg? Like, this is a bizarre object, but out of this object is created a theme around the problem of form. Right? We kind of conceptualize a theme, and then that becomes an intellectual question that then we can invite people from all over the world to come and think about with us, right? But there's an insistence that the theme must be produced out of a difficult object that we can't make sense of, right? So it's precisely the conundrum that emerges out of an object that we can't make sense of that becomes the basis for what, in our view, is a Southern intellectual project. So I like this idea of uncharted objects, objects that are difficult, that are stubborn. Yeah. But I also find that, one of the things that we do when we talk about the project of the South is to talk a lot about how difficult and impossible it is to think about the South, right? Or how it's not a place, it's not a thing, it's not a practice, it's all of these things that you've gestured towards so eloquently. But it feels like as soon as we try and give a content to that quite speculative set of ideas, it gets very tricky, right? Because then we precisely run into the sea of stereotype, the history of charted objects. So I'm wondering if you can, I really like just the suggestion that I got from the translation around land, but can you give a little bit more specificity to how you would deal with an object? Like, can you give more precision to what is the methodology that you would how would you chart a methodology of uncharted objects, right?
I've been working with this for 10 years now. And it is hard. The first thing is, and one of the most important things is to have and to raise different perspectives over those objects. I think this is the first, because this idea how we create, and the problem is with whom we are creating these objects. These objects, they cannot be created alone by academics. I think this is the first thing. Because our tools, our resources are very narrow-minded in the way we are always running behind certain theories, patterns, methods. So the first issue is to build it together with other people. In my case, I do work with the farm dwellers, sometimes labor tenants, but one of the issues I do, and I really do with them, is to discuss and to share with them ideas on land. So I go to the farms, I stay in the farms for at least 1 month a year, and I discuss with them and I argue with them about those objects in different situations. I go with them to deal with the farmers, with the Department of Land Affairs. I go to funerals and try to catch it from different situations, but also from different in the different situations they are involved into.
Can I just only quote Ashuna Panubai? Actually, during the workshop at JWTC, at the beginning of his paper, which I to do with this quote, he said, we are here in a seminar or in a workshop that makes itself theory of itself, and then he said, I don't think that there's a theory of the South. I think that there's a South of theory. And he didn't elaborate on that, and he didn't talk about that, but it was quite, and it's not practice. He didn't mean that, the North has the theory and the South has the practice, as also Marcelo was criticizing this idea. He meant that theory, the thing as such, as theory, comes from the North. And maybe here knowledge production doesn't use theory, maybe it has different approaches to what's going on.
Acho, com relação a essa questão do Sul e o que se faz disso, eu também acho que a gente não pode deixar de considerar que existe muito fortemente nessa questão do Sul, como você disse, a questão econômica. Claro que o Sul ele é usado um pouco, às vezes, como substituto da ideia de periferia, de terceiro mundo, né? Para dizer que, bom, finalmente, não é que lá não tem nada, lá as pessoas pensam, criam, etc. Isso é ok, mas a gente não pode, acho que, elidir o fator econômico. Porque a violência a opressão se dá, assim, enfim, o jeito mais cruel, a expressão mais cruel dela é, de fato, a exclusão.